It was February 2022, in a small town outside Lexington. Sundays at St. James had always been routine for us, coffee after service, my daughter's husband handling the camera feeds for the church website, and me helping fold bulletins in the back room. That morning, something felt off, not dramatic, just quieter than usual. The organ started half a beat late. The service ran long. When the pastor joked about technical difficulties, no one laughed. A week later, I offered to help clean the office. That is when I saw it, an unlabeled thumb drive on the desk, still warm from the computer. I thought it was just another choir recording. It was not. I remember standing there, the small plastic device in my hand, feeling its residual heat against my palm. Outside, February light filtered through the stained glass, casting colored shadows across the carpet. I slipped the drive into my cardigan pocket and continued straightening papers. No one noticed. No one asked. That night, alone in my kitchen, I plugged it into my laptop. The screen filled with grainy security footage, no audio, just silent gray images timestamped Friday, 7:52 p.m. Two figures moved across the sanctuary floor. I recognized them immediately. One was my son-in-law. The other was Ellen, the church organist. I watched for exactly 1 minute before closing the window. Then I ejected the drive, labeled it Inventory 2022, and placed it in my desk drawer beneath old tax returns. I did not tell anyone. I did not cry. I simply sat there in the quiet, listening to the refrigerator hum, and began to think. Because I have always believed that truth does not need witnesses. Just timing. Let me tell you how it unfolded. Margaret Lane had turned 56 that January. She lived alone in a modest ranch house 3 miles from St. James Episcopal Church, where she had worshipped for nearly 30 years. The house was simple, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with yellow linoleum that she kept meaning to replace, but never did. She had worked as a school secretary for 23 years before retiring early to care for her late husband during his final illness. Now she filled her days with volunteer work, gardening, and the occasional lunch with her daughter Laura. Laura was 34, sharp-featured and practical, a loan officer at First National Bank in downtown Lexington. She had married Ryan Lane 4 years earlier in that same church, beneath the oak beams and brass chandeliers, with white roses lining the aisle. Ryan was 39 then, confident and broad-shouldered, with an easy smile and a firm handshake that made people trust him immediately. He worked in IT support, but volunteered his Sundays to manage the church's media booth, cameras, sound levels, the live stream that broadcast services to shut-ins and distant members. Margaret had liked him at first. He seemed dependable. He called her Ma, brought wine to family dinners, fixed Laura's laptop without being asked. But over the past 6 months, something has shifted. Small things. A distance in his voice when he answered the phone. The way he checked his watch during Sunday coffee hour. How he volunteered for evening shifts that did not need covering. That first Sunday in February 2022 had been unseasonably cold. Margaret arrived at 9:45 a.m., as she always did, carrying a Tupperware container of homemade shortbread for the hospitality table. The parking lot was half full. Inside, the sanctuary smelled of furniture polish and old hymnals. She found her usual spot in the 3rd pew from the back, left side, near the carved wooden pillar that had a small chip in its base from when someone dropped a brass candlestick in 1998. Ryan was already in the media booth, a glassed-in room at the rear of the balcony. She could see him through the window, headphones on, adjusting knobs on the soundboard. He did not look down. He did not wave. Ellen Brooke, the organist, sat at the console near the altar, her back to the congregation. She was 44, widowed 3 years prior when her husband died in a car accident on Interstate 64. She had thick auburn hair that she wore in a loose bun, and a soft voice that made people lean in to hear her. She played beautifully Bach, Handel, the occasional contemporary hymn arranged with delicate improvisation. After her husband passed, the church embraced her. Pastor Reed gave her flexible hours. The choir included her in dinners. Margaret herself had brought casseroles during those first raw months. But recently, Ellen had started lingering after services. She would sit at the organ bench, fingers resting on the keys, long after the last congregant left. When Margaret asked if she needed anything, Ellen would smile and say she was fine, just clearing her mind. That morning, the prelude began late. The first notes trembled, then steadied. Margaret noticed Ellen glance toward the media booth. Just once. Just a second. Then her hands moved across the keys with practiced grace. The service proceeded normally. Hymns. Readings. A sermon about patience and trust. Communion. Announcements. By 11:30, people were filtering out, shaking the pastor's hand, retrieving coats from the hooks in the vestibule. Margaret helped fold the cloth napkins from the coffee station and wiped down the counters. Ryan stayed in the booth, typing something on his laptop. Ellen played a postlude, soft and meandering. At noon, Margaret went home. She made a turkey sandwich, ate it standing at the kitchen window, and thought about nothing in particular. It was an ordinary Sunday. Forgettable. Until the following Tuesday, when she returned to the church for the weekly prayer committee meeting. The meeting was held in the same office where Ryan managed the media files, a cramped room with a metal desk, 2 filing cabinets, and a computer monitor that displayed a grid of security camera feeds. 4 women attended: Margaret, 2 retirees named Dottie and Fran, and a younger woman named Carla who worked night shifts at the hospital and often fell asleep during prayers. They gathered at 6:30 p.m. The office smelled of coffee and old carpet. Pastor Reed stopped by briefly to thank them, then left to prepare for evening services. The women prayed for 15 minutes, standard intercessions for the sick, the traveling, the grieving. Then they chatted. Dottie talked about her grandson's soccer tournament. Fran mentioned a recipe she had seen on television. Margaret listened politely, her gaze drifting toward the computer monitor. The security feeds rotated every 10 seconds: sanctuary, hallway, parking lot, kitchen, fellowship hall, office. The images were grainy, black and white, time-stamped in the lower right corner. She had never paid much attention before, but now she did. At 7:15, the meeting ended. The women gathered their purses and Bibles. Margaret lingered, straightening chairs, stacking hymnals on the shelf. When everyone had gone, she stood alone in the office. The monitor cycled through its rotation. She stepped closer, studying the timestamps, the angles, the empty rooms. Then she saw it. On the metal desk, beside the keyboard, rested a small black thumb drive. It was not labeled. It was still faintly warm. Margaret stared at it for a long moment. Outside, car doors slammed. Voices echoed in the parking lot. She reached out, picked up the drive, and turned it over in her hand. Plastic. Generic. Unremarkable. She slipped it into her coat pocket and left. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and her laptop. The house was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock above the stove. She inserted the thumb drive. A folder appeared. Church Media, January. Inside were files labeled by date. She opened one at random. The screen filled with security footage. No sound. Just gray, pixelated images of the sanctuary, shot from the camera mounted above the rear entrance. The timestamp read Friday, January 28th, 7:52 p.m. The sanctuary was empty. Then 2 figures entered from the side door near the organ. Even in the grainy footage, Margaret recognized them. Ryan wore his usual fleece jacket and jeans. Ellen wore a long cardigan and dark slacks. They walked slowly, not touching, but close. They stopped near the altar. Ellen gestured toward the organ. Ryan nodded. They stood there for perhaps 20 seconds. Then the footage cut to black. Margaret closed the file. Her hands were steady. She opened another. Friday, February 4th, 8:03 p.m. Same location. Same 2 people. This time, Ellen sat at the organ bench. Ryan leaned against the console, arms crossed, watching her. No music. No sound. Just 2 figures in an empty church. She opened a 3rd file. A 4th. Each showed the same pattern. Friday evenings. Between 7:40 and 8:15. Always the sanctuary. Always the 2 of them. Margaret watched for 37 minutes. Then she ejected the drive, opened a document on her desktop, and typed a single line, Inventory 2022. She saved it, printed a small label, affixed it to the drive, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk beneath a stack of old utility bills. She did not call her daughter. She did not confront Ryan. She simply turned off the lamp, washed her teacup, and went to bed. Because she understood something important: noise creates chaos. Silence creates clarity. And clarity was what she needed. The following Sunday, Margaret arrived early. She parked in her usual spot, carried her shortbread inside, and made her way to the hospitality table. The church was already filling. Families clustered in pews. Children chased each other down the aisles. The organist was not yet at her post. Margaret set down her Tupperware and walked casually toward the hallway that led to the media office. The door was closed but not locked. She pushed it open. Inside, the computer monitor displayed the rotating security feeds. The desk was cluttered with cables, USB drives, and sticky notes. No one was there. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The monitor showed the current feeds. She leaned closer, studying the rotation. Sanctuary. Hallway. Parking lot. Kitchen. Fellowship hall. Office. 10 seconds each. She memorized the sequence, the angles, the blind spots. Then she noticed the filing cabinet in the corner. 2 drawers. The top one was labeled Archive. She pulled it open. Inside were rows of labeled DVDs and external hard drives, organized by month and year. She ran her finger along the labels. November 2021. December 2021. January 2022. She closed the drawer quietly and left the room. That afternoon, after the service, Margaret stayed to help clean the fellowship hall. Laura and Ryan were there, stacking chairs, wiping tables. Laura looked tired. Her makeup was heavier than usual, covering shadows beneath her eyes. Ryan was on his phone, texting someone, his face turned toward the wall. Margaret approached her daughter. "Are you feeling all right?" Laura looked up, forced a smile. "Just tired." "Are you working late?" "Ryan is," Laura said. "Sound checks. Easter prep. In February." Laura shrugged. "He likes to plan ahead." Margaret nodded, said nothing more, and returned to folding tablecloths. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with a spiral notebook and a pen. She opened a blank page and wrote, "Timeline." Then, beneath it, she listed dates and observations. January 21st, Ryan mentions an evening meeting at church. January 28th, security footage, 7:52 p.m. February 4th, security footage, 8:03 p.m. February 11th, Ellen stays late, says she is practicing. February 12th, Ryan arrives home at 9:45 p.m., says the soundboard needed repairs. She did not write conclusions. She did not write suspicions. She wrote only facts. Then she closed the notebook and placed it in the same drawer as the thumb drive. By mid-February, the weather had turned. Ice coated the trees. Morning frost lingered on windshields. Margaret kept to her routines. She attended the Tuesday prayer meetings, volunteered at the church thrift store on Thursdays, and joined her daughter for lunch every other Saturday. During those lunches, she observed. Laura spoke less. She picked at her salad, checked her phone, apologized for being distracted. When Margaret asked about Ryan, Laura said he was busy. When Margaret asked if everything was all right, Laura said yes, just tired. Margaret did not press. She simply listened, nodded, and paid the check. At church, she began to notice other things. Ellen arrived 15 minutes before each service, earlier than necessary. Ryan stayed in the media booth during coffee hour, claiming he needed to review recordings. When they passed each other in the hallway, they did not speak, but their eyes met for just a fraction of a second. Margaret saw it. She said nothing. On the last Tuesday of February, the prayer committee met again. This time, Margaret arrived 20 minutes early. The office was unlocked. She stepped inside, closed the door, and sat down at the computer. The screen was asleep. She moved the mouse. It woke me up. A browser window was open. Multiple tabs. One showed the church calendar. Another showed a file directory. She clicked on it. The folder was labeled Security Archive, January to February. Inside were dozens of video files, each named by date and camera location. She scanned the list. Her eyes stopped on one, February 18th, Sanctuary Rear, 1945 hours. She double-clicked. The video player opened. Grainy footage. The sanctuary, shot from the back. The timestamp read Friday, February 18th, 7:45 p.m. The image was still. Then Ellen entered from the side door. She walked to the organ, removed her coat, and sat on the bench. A moment later, Ryan appeared. He stood beside her. She said something. He nodded. Then she reached up and placed her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was brief, casual, but unmistakable. Margaret watched the screen. Her face remained calm. Her breathing is steady. She let the footage play for another 30 seconds, then closed the window, cleared the browser history, and returned the computer to its screensaver. She stood, straightened her sweater, and left the office. When the other committee members arrived, she was already seated in her usual chair, hands folded in her lap, ready to pray. By early March, Margaret had developed a routine. Every Tuesday, she arrived early to the prayer meeting. Every Tuesday, she spent 10 minutes alone in the office, reviewing the security logs. She did not download files. She did not disturb anything. She simply watched, noted timestamps, and memorized patterns. Friday evenings between 7:30 and 8:30. Always the sanctuary. Always the same two people. She kept her observations in the spiral notebook. Dates, times, camera angles, brief descriptions. No interpretations. No emotions. Just data. On March 12th, a Saturday, Margaret met Laura for lunch at a diner on Main Street. They sat in a booth near the window. Laura ordered soup but barely touched it. Her face was drawn. She kept glancing at her phone. Margaret stirred her coffee. "How is work?" "Busy," Laura said. "And Ryan?" "He is fine. Still working late." Laura looked up. "Why do you keep asking about Ryan?" Margaret met her gaze. "I am not asking about Ryan. I am asking about you." Laura blinked. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, doubt, maybe, or exhaustion. Then she looked away. "I am fine, Mom." Margaret did not argue. She simply reached across the table and touched her daughter's hand. "All right." They finished lunch in near silence. Afterward, Margaret drove home and added a single line to her notebook, March 12th. Laura is not fine. Spring arrived slowly. By late March, the trees were budding. Mornings smelled of wet grass and warming soil. Easter preparations began at St. James. The choir practiced every Wednesday evening. The altar guild ordered lilies. Pastor Reed announced that the service would be broadcast live, with extended coverage, requiring additional technical support. Ryan volunteered immediately. On the Tuesday before Palm Sunday, Margaret attended the prayer meeting as usual. She arrived early, entered the office, and found something new, a printed schedule taped to the wall above the desk. It listed media responsibilities for Holy Week. Ryan's name appeared beside every evening slot, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Underneath each entry, someone had handwritten, "Ellen assists with audio cues." Margaret studied the schedule. Then she took out her phone and photographed it. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop. She created a new folder on her desktop and labeled it Insurance. Inside, she placed a document. She typed carefully, listing every date she had observed, every timestamp, every instance of late-night access. She included no accusations, no assumptions, just facts. When she finished, she saved the document, backed it up to a private cloud account, and deleted the local copy. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, April. Time to prepare. Holy Week arrived. The church was busy with services, rehearsals, decorating. Margaret helped arrange flowers in the sanctuary, white lilies, tulips, branches of forsythia. She worked quietly alongside the other volunteers, polite and unremarkable. On Maundy Thursday evening, she attended the service. The sanctuary was full. Candles flickered on the altar. Ellen played the prelude, a somber Bach fugue. Ryan operated the cameras from the booth. Margaret sat in her usual pew, hymn book in hand, and observed. After the service, she stayed to help fold altar linens. Laura was there, folding with mechanical precision. Ryan left immediately, saying he needed to check equipment for Good Friday. Ellen stayed at the organ, playing softly, even though the service had ended 20 minutes earlier. Margaret approached her daughter. "Can I give you a ride home?" Laura shook her head. "Ryan is coming back. He just needed to grab something." Margaret nodded. She folded the last cloth napkin, placed it in the drawer, and left. That night, she sat at her desk and made a list. Not of observations, of actions. 1. Request administrative access to media archives. 2. Download and secure all relevant footage. 3. Document chain of custody. 4. Consult legal counsel. 5. Prepare for internal review. She numbered each item carefully, using her neat, schoolteacher handwriting. When she finished, she placed the list in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote on the front, "Property Evidence, May 2022. Then she placed it in her desk drawer, turned off the lamp, and went to bed. Because revenge is not about anger. It is about strategy. On Easter Sunday, the church was radiant. White lilies lined the altar. The brass cross gleamed. Sunlight poured through the stained glass, casting pools of blue and red across the stone floor. Margaret wore a pale yellow dress and pearl earrings. She arrived early, as always, and took her seat in the third pew. The service was long hymns, readings, a baptism, communion, a sermon about resurrection and renewal. Ellen played with particular intensity, her hands moving across the keys with force and precision. Ryan managed 3 cameras, switching angles smoothly, capturing the choir, the altar, and the congregation. Margaret watched it all with calm detachment. After the service, there was a reception in the fellowship hall, coffee, pastries, a table of donated baked goods. Margaret helped serve. Laura stood near the window, talking to a coworker from the bank. Ryan was outside, packing camera equipment into his car. Ellen sat alone at a corner table, sipping tea, her face unreadable. Margaret approached the pastor. "Do you have a moment?" Pastor Reed looked up, smiled. "Of course, Margaret. I would like to help with the Easter broadcast archives," she said. "For backup purposes." He nodded absently. "That would be wonderful. Ryan handles all that, but I am sure he could use the support. Would it be possible for me to have access to the media files? Just to organize them." "Of course," Pastor Reed said. "I will have Ryan set you up with credentials." "Thank you for volunteering." Margaret smiled. "My pleasure." That afternoon, she received an email from Ryan. Subject: Media Access. The message was brief, login and password attached. "Let me know if you need anything." She did not reply. She simply saved the email, printed it, and filed it in a folder labeled Church Correspondence. Then she logged into the church server. The archive was extensive. Hundreds of video files, organized by date and camera. She spent 3 hours reviewing them, cross-referencing her notebook, confirming timestamps. When she found a file that matched her observations, she downloaded it to an external hard drive. She worked methodically, without hurry, copying 4 months of footage, January through April. When she finished, she logged out, disconnected the hard drive, and placed it in a small fireproof safe beneath her bed. She did not watch the files again. She did not need to. She had already seen enough. By early May, the church had returned to its normal rhythm. Easter decorations were stored. The lilies were gone. Weekly services resumed their familiar structure. Margaret continued her volunteer work, prayer meetings, thrift store shifts, flower arranging. But now she had something else. On the second Tuesday in May, she made an appointment with her family lawyer, a man named Harold Brennan, who had handled her husband's estate 6 years earlier. His office was in a converted Victorian house on 3rd Street, with creaking floors and built-in bookshelves. Margaret arrived at 3 p.m., carrying a manila envelope. Harold greeted her warmly. Margaret, good to see you. What can I do for you? She sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I need to update my will. Of course, he said, pulling out a legal pad. They spent 40 minutes reviewing her assets, the house, her savings, her late husband's pension. She made small changes, adding a codicil, adjusting percentages. Harold took notes, asked clarifying questions, and prepared the documents. When they finished, Margaret placed the manila envelope on his desk. I also need you to notarize something. Certainly. She opened the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. It was a typed affidavit, signed and dated, stating that she, Margaret and Lane, was in lawful possession of digital media files obtained with authorized access from St. James Episcopal Church, and that said files were being held in secure storage for potential use in matters of church administration and personnel review. Harold read it carefully. This is unusual. I know. May I ask why you need this? Margaret met his gaze. I would prefer not to say. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right. He notarized the document, affixed his seal, and handed it back to her. She placed it in the envelope, thanked him, and left. That evening, she filed the notarized affidavit in her fireproof safe, beside the external hard drive and the sealed envelope labeled property evidence. Everything was in place. June arrived with heat and humidity. The church windows stayed open during services. Fans hummed in the fellowship hall. The choir took a break for the summer, replaced by recorded hymns. Ellen continued to play on Sundays, but her presence felt diminished, somehow quieter, less central. Ryan still managed the media booth, but he seemed distracted. He missed a camera cue during the sermon. He forgot to unmute the microphone during announcements. Pastor Reed joked about technical difficulties, and the congregation laughed politely. Margaret noticed everything. On the first Tuesday in June, the church held its annual finance and operations audit. It was a routine meeting held every year, attended by the vestry, the treasurer, the pastor, and a few key volunteers. Margaret had attended twice before, as a courtesy, since she helped with hospitality budgets. This year, she requested to be on the agenda. The meeting was held in the parish hall, around a long oak table. 12 people attended. Margaret sat near the end, a plain folder in front of her, her hands folded calmly in her lap. The meeting proceeded through standard items: budget review, facility repairs, insurance updates. Pastor Reed ran through each topic efficiently, glancing at his watch. When they reached any other business, Margaret raised her hand. Yes, Margaret. She opened her folder. I would like to discuss unauthorized use of church equipment. The room went quiet. Pastor Reed frowned. I am sorry. Margaret removed a single sheet of paper from her folder and slid it across the table toward him. These are access logs from the media server, showing repeated late-night entries using Ryan Lane's credentials outside of scheduled church activities. The pastor picked up the sheet, scanned it, his brow furrowing. The treasurer leaned over to look. One of the vestry members whispered something. Margaret continued, her voice calm and factual. The entries occurred on Friday evenings between 7:30 and 8:30 p.m. over a period of 4 months. The security footage from those times shows unauthorized presence in the sanctuary. Pastor Reed looked up. Unauthorized by whom? Ryan Lane and Ellen Brooke. The room erupted in murmurs. Someone asked a question. Someone else objected. Margaret sat quietly, waiting. Pastor Reed raised his hand for silence. Margaret, this is a serious allegation. I am not making an allegation, she said. I am presenting data. Do you have proof? She did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression neutral. Then she said, I have timestamps, access logs, and security footage, all obtained with authorized credentials. If the vestry wishes to review the material, I can provide it. The room fell silent. Pastor Reed set down the paper. His face was pale. I think we need to handle this internally. I agree, Margaret said. He cleared his throat. I will initiate a review. We will need to speak with Ryan and Ellen privately. Margaret nodded. Of course. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. People filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact. Margaret remained seated, gathering her folder, her movements unhurried. Pastor Reed approached her. "Margaret, I need to ask, why now? Why bring this to us this way?" She looked up at him. "Because it was the right time." He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I see. I trust you will handle it appropriately," she said. "I will." She stood, tucked her folder under her arm, and left. The review took 3 days. On Thursday morning, Pastor Reed met privately with Ryan. The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Ryan left the building without speaking to anyone. On Thursday afternoon, Pastor Reed met with Ellen. She emerged from his office 23 minutes later, her face blotchy and red. She did not return for Sunday service. On Friday, 2 letters were delivered by certified mail. One to Ryan Lane, one to Ellen Brooke. Both letters, on church letterhead, cited violations of equipment use policy, misuse of church property, and conduct inconsistent with volunteer responsibilities. Both requested immediate resignation. By Monday, both had complied. Margaret learned about it not from gossip, but from an email Pastor Reed sent to the vestry and key volunteers. Subject: Personnel changes. The message was brief, professional, devoid of detail. It stated that Ryan Lane and Ellen Brooke had resigned their positions, effective immediately, for personal reasons. It thanked them for their service and wished them well. It announced that new volunteers would be trained to assume their duties. Margaret read the email once, then deleted it. That evening, Laura called. Her voice was tight, controlled. "Mom, did you know about this?" "About what?" Margaret asked. "About Ryan. About the church." Margaret sat down at her kitchen table. "What did they tell you?" "They sent him a letter. Human resources. Misconduct. Unauthorized use of property." Margaret said nothing. Laura's voice cracked. "Did you know?" "Yes." Silence. Then Laura said, "How long?" "Since February." "Why did you not tell me?" Margaret closed her eyes. "Because you needed proof, not suspicion." Laura inhaled sharply. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that does not require my word against his." Another silence. Then Laura said quietly, "I need to go." "Laura, I will call you later." The line went dead. Margaret set down the phone and stared at the kitchen wall. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the heat. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the window. She did not cry. She simply sat there, hands folded, waiting for the next thing. Because this was not about victory. It was about truth. By mid-June, the church had replaced both Ryan and Ellen. A retired engineer named Frank took over the media booth. A young pianist from the university covered Sunday preludes until a permanent organist could be hired. The transition was smooth, unremarkable. Within 2 weeks, it was as if Ryan and Ellen had never been there. Margaret continued her routines. She attended services, folded bulletins, and poured coffee. People thanked her for her dedication. She smiled politely and said it was no trouble. Laura did not call for 3 weeks. When she finally did, her voice was different. Flatter. Older. "I filed for divorce," she said. Margaret was standing at her kitchen counter, slicing tomatoes for a salad. She set down the knife. "When?" "Yesterday. Do you need help?" "I do not know what I need." Margaret closed her eyes. "Would you like to come over?" "Not tonight." "All right." Laura exhaled. He moved out. "He is staying with a friend from work." "Good." "Mom, I do not," she stopped. "I do not know how to feel about this." "You do not have to know yet." Another pause. Then Laura said quietly, "Thank you." Margaret opened her eyes. "For what?" "For not making me choose between believing you and believing him." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "You do not need to thank me." "Yes, I do." They talked for another 10 minutes. Small things. Weather. Work. The divorce lawyer Laura had contacted. When they hung up, Margaret stood at the counter for a long time, staring at the half-sliced tomato, the knife resting beside it. Then she finished making her salad, ate it slowly at the table, and washed her dishes. By July, the details became routine. Laura's lawyer filed the petition. Ryan's lawyer responded. There were no children, no jointly owned property. The process was straightforward, cold, and administrative. They agreed to mediation. They divided their belongings. Ryan took the furniture. Laura took the savings. Margaret helped her daughter move into a small rental apartment on the east side of town, 2 bedrooms, hardwood floors, a kitchen with good light. They carried boxes up the stairs in silence. Unpacked dishes. Assembled a bookshelf. Hung curtains. On the second day, as they were organizing the closet, Laura stopped and sat down on the bedroom floor. She did not cry. She just sat there, arms wrapped around her knees, staring at nothing. Margaret sat down beside her. "I feel so stupid," Laura said quietly. "You are not stupid. I did not see it. Because you trusted him. I should not have." Margaret shook her head. "Trust is not foolishness. Betrayal is not your fault." Laura looked at her. "Did you ever suspect anything about Dad?" Margaret thought about her late husband, the gentle man who had died too young, who had fixed her tea every morning and kissed her forehead before leaving for work. She thought about trust that was earned, not assumed. "No," she said simply. Laura nodded. They sat there together on the floor, surrounded by boxes, the afternoon light slanting through the window. After a while, Laura said, "What did you see on that footage?" Margaret considered her answer carefully. "Enough." "Did they?" Laura stopped. "I do not want to know. You do not need to. But you saw it." "Yes." Laura wiped her eyes. "Where is it now?" "Safe. Do you still have it?" "Yes." "Why?" Margaret looked at her daughter. "Because sometimes the truth is not about what people see. It is about what they cannot deny." Laura stared at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and stood up. "Let us finish unpacking." They worked until evening, labeling boxes, arranging furniture, creating order from chaos. When Margaret left, she hugged her daughter tightly. "You are going to be all right," she said. Laura held on a moment longer. "I know." By September, the divorce was finalized. Laura signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon, alone in her lawyer's office. She called Margaret afterward. "It is done. How do you feel?" "Tired. Come over for dinner." "I cannot tonight. I have to work late." "Tomorrow, then." "All right." But when tomorrow came, Laura called and said she was not ready yet. She needed time. She needed space. She would call when she was ready. Margaret did not press. She simply said, "I am here." In the meantime, she returned to her routines. She attended church every Sunday. She volunteered at the thrift store. She tended her garden, pulling weeds, deadheading roses. She lived her life quietly, without fanfare, without expectation. Ryan disappeared from town. Someone said he had moved to Louisville. Someone else said he had taken a job in Ohio. Margaret did not ask. She did not care. Ellen left as well. Her house went on the market in August, sold by October. A young family moved in, painted the shutters blue, and planted a vegetable garden in the backyard. At St. James, the church hired a new organist, a woman in her 60s named Patricia, cheerful and efficient, who played hymns with precision and left immediately after services. She did not linger. She did not stay late. She simply did her job and went home. Margaret approved. By November, a year had passed since the first discovery. The leaves were falling again. The air smelled of wood smoke and rain. Margaret woke each morning, made her coffee, and sat at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper in the soft light. On the second Sunday in November, Laura returned to church. She entered quietly, slipping into a pew near the back. Margaret saw her immediately but did not approach. She simply smiled from across the sanctuary and returned her attention to the service. Afterward, as people gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee, Laura walked over. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." They stood together, not speaking, just present. Then Laura said, "The choir needs altos." Margaret looked at her. "Are you thinking about joining?" "Maybe. You have a beautiful voice." Laura smiled faintly. "I have not sung in years." "All the more reason." They stayed for coffee, talking quietly about small things, work, weather, plans for Thanksgiving. When they left, they walked to the parking lot together. Laura hugged her mother before getting into her car. "Thank you," she said again. Margaret held her. You do not have to keep thanking me. Yes, I do. Laura drove away. Margaret watched until the car turned the corner, then got into her own car and drove home. That afternoon, she opened the fireproof safe beneath her bed. Inside were 3 items: the external hard drive, the notarized affidavit, and the sealed envelope labeled property evidence, May 2022. She removed all 3, placed them in a larger envelope, and sealed it with tape. Then she wrote on the front, Estate Documents, M. Lane. Do not open. The next morning, she drove to the bank and rented a safe deposit box. She placed the envelope inside, locked it, and handed the key to the attendant. Please file this under my account, she said. Of course, Mrs. Lane. She left the bank and drove home. She did not feel relief. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt only the quiet certainty that comes from finishing something difficult and necessary. That evening, she sat on her back porch, watching the sunset. The sky turned orange, then pink, then deep purple. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere down the street, children laughed. Margaret sipped her tea and thought about nothing in particular. Because the story was over. The rest was just living. Winter came slowly that year. By December, frost covered the grass each morning. Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows. The church prepared for Advent. Margaret helped string lights in the sanctuary, arrange poinsettias on the altar, and organize the holiday food drive. Laura joined the choir in early December. She stood in the alto section, 3rd row, her voice blending with the others. She did not sing loudly, but she sang steadily, finding her place in the harmonies. Margaret watched from her pew, her hymn book open but unread. She listened to her daughter's voice rising with the others, filling the old stone sanctuary with sound. It was a small moment. Unremarkable. But it mattered. On Christmas Eve, the church was packed. Families filled every pew. Candlelight flickered. The choir sang once more, their voices strong and sure. Laura sang the descant on the final hymn, her voice clear and high, carrying over the congregation. When the service ended, people lingered, shaking hands, wishing each other Merry Christmas. Margaret stood near the door, handing out programs for the midnight service. Laura helped collect hymn books, stacking them neatly on the shelf. As they worked, Pastor Reed approached. Margaret, Laura, thank you for all your help this season. Of course, Margaret said. He hesitated, then added quietly, I want you to know, the situation from last year, it was handled correctly. You did the right thing. Margaret met his gaze. I know. He nodded, shook her hand, and moved on to greet other parishioners. Laura looked at her mother. Does everyone know? No, Margaret said. And they never will. Good. They finished their tasks in silence. When the sanctuary was empty, they walked out together into the cold December night. Snow had begun to fall, light flakes drifting through the streetlights. Laura stopped on the steps. Mom, I have been thinking. About what? About why you waited. Margaret turned to face her. And what did you decide? Laura considered her words carefully. You waited because you knew I would not have believed you without proof. And you knew that proof had to come from somewhere I could not argue with. Yes, that must have been hard. To carry that alone. Margaret shook her head. It was not hard. It was necessary. Laura smiled faintly. You're stronger than I am. No, Margaret said. I am older. There is a difference. They stood together on the church steps, watching the snow fall. Then Laura said, I am glad you are my mother. Margaret took her daughter's hand. I am glad you are my daughter. They walked to their cars, snow dusting their coats, their breath visible in the cold air. As Margaret drove home, she thought about the small thumb drive locked in the safe deposit box at the bank. She thought about the silent footage, the careful documentation, the quiet accumulation of truth. She thought about how easy it would have been to confront Ryan immediately, to shout, to accuse, to make a scene. And she thought about why she had not. Because confrontation creates chaos. And chaos creates doubt. And doubt creates room for denial. But evidence creates certainty. And certainty creates accountability. And accountability, when applied correctly, creates justice. She had given her daughter justice. Not revenge. Not humiliation. Just the simple, undeniable truth, delivered through proper channels, witnessed by officials, documented and sealed. It was not satisfying in the way people imagined revenge to be. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no public shaming, no tearful apology. But it was complete. And that was enough. By the time Margaret reached her house, the snow was falling harder. She parked in the driveway, walked up the path, and unlocked her front door. Inside, the house was warm. She turned on the Christmas tree lights, made a cup of tea, and sat in her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the world was white and silent. She thought about the organ at St. James, still sitting unused near the altar. The church had allocated funds for repairs, but the work kept getting delayed. Budget constraints, they said. Scheduling conflicts. It would be fixed eventually. But for now, it sat silent, a reminder of something broken that had not yet been made whole. Margaret did not mind. Some things took time. Some things required patience. Some things were better left untouched until the moment was right. She sipped her tea and watched the snow accumulate on the trees outside her window. In January, a full year after that first discovery, Laura invited Margaret to lunch. They met at the same diner on Main Street where they had sat a year earlier, when Laura had barely touched her soup and could not meet her mother's eyes. This time was different. Laura ordered a sandwich and ate it. She talked about work, about a promotion she was being considered for, about a book club she had joined. Her face had color again. Her eyes were clear. Margaret listened, asked questions, smiled at the right moments. Near the end of the meal, Laura set down her fork and looked at her mother. "I need to ask you something." "All right. That footage. The evidence. What are you going to do with it?" Margaret wiped her mouth with a napkin, considering. "Nothing. Nothing. It is sealed. It will remain sealed. When I die, it will be destroyed per instructions in my will." Laura frowned. "Why keep it at all?" "Because truth has value," Margaret said simply. "Not because it needs to be seen, but because it exists." Laura thought about this. That does not make sense. It does not have to. They paid the check and walked out into the cold afternoon. As they stood beside their cars, Laura hugged her mother tightly. "I love you," she said. "I love you too." They drove away in opposite directions. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and opened her spiral notebook for the last time. She flipped through the pages, reading her careful notes. Dates. Times. Observations. The quiet accumulation of evidence, the patient documentation of truth. Then she closed the notebook, placed it in her fireproof safe, and locked it. She would not open it again. Spring has returned. The trees bloomed. The grass greened. Margaret planted tomatoes and peppers in her garden. She attended church each Sunday, folded bulletins, and poured coffee. Laura sang in the choir, her voice growing stronger each week. In March, the church finally began repairs on the organ. A technician came on a Tuesday, dismantled the console, replaced worn felts and broken keys. The work took 3 weeks. On the first Sunday in April, Patricia played it for the first time since the repairs. The sound filled the sanctuary, full, rich, resonant. People turned in their pews, surprised by the beauty of it. Margaret sat in her usual spot, third pew from the back, and listened. She thought about Ellen, wherever she was now. She thought about Ryan, living in another city with a new job and a new name. She thought about the secrets people carry, the lies they tell, the way betrayal takes root quietly before it blooms. And she thought about truth, how it waits, how it gathers, how it reveals itself not in moments of rage, but in moments of stillness. The organ played on Bach's Prelude in C major, familiar and eternal. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. When the service ended, she helped stack hymn books, folded altar cloths, and wiped down the coffee station. She did not hurry. She did not linger. She simply did her work, as she always had, with quiet precision. As she was leaving, Pastor Reed stopped her. "Margaret, I wanted to thank you again." "For what?" "For handling that situation with such grace." She looked at him steadily. "I did not handle it with grace. I handled it with facts. He smiled faintly. Same thing, perhaps. Perhaps. He patted her shoulder and walked away. Margaret stepped out into the spring sunshine. The parking lot was emptying. Families loaded children into cars. The choir members chatted near the side entrance. Laura stood among them, laughing at something someone had said. Margaret watched her daughter for a moment, then got into her car and drove home. That afternoon, she sat on her back porch with a book. The air smelled of lilacs. Bees hummed in the garden. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked. She read for an hour, then set the book aside and closed her eyes. She thought about the small thumb drive locked in the bank vault. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, uncertain, watchful, carrying the weight of knowledge alone. She thought about the woman she was now, lighter, perhaps, but not because the weight had been lifted. Because she had set it down in the right place, at the right time, in the right way. Justice was not about punishment. It was about balance. And balance, she had learned, came not from action, but from knowing when to act and when to wait. She opened her eyes and looked at her garden. The tomatoes were flowering. The peppers were budding. Life continued, as it always did, in small green cycles of growth and rest. She stood, brushed off her skirt, and went inside to make dinner. By summer, the church had settled into its new normal. Frank managed the media booth with quiet efficiency. Patricia played hymns with precision. The choir performed at weddings and funerals. The rhythm of Sunday mornings returned to its familiar pattern, predictable, comforting, unchanged. Margaret continued her volunteer work. She folded bulletins, arranged flowers, and served coffee. She became, once again, unremarkable. A fixture in the background, steady and dependable, the kind of person people thanked absently without really seeing. And that was exactly how she preferred it. Because she had learned something important: power does not require recognition. It does not need applause or gratitude or public acknowledgement. It simply is, quiet and patient, waiting to be used when necessary and forgotten when not. She had used hers. She had restored balance. And now she was content to return to the background, to let life resume its ordinary course. Laura thrived in her new life. She bought a small house on Elm Street, painted the shutters green, and planted a garden in the backyard. She invited Margaret over for Sunday dinners. They cooked together, ate together, talked about small things, work, books, the weather. Neither of them mentioned Ryan. Neither of them mentioned Ellen. Neither of them spoke about that year at all. It was not avoidance. It was simply completion. The story was told. The chapter was closed. There was nothing more to say. One Sunday in late August, as they were washing dishes after dinner, Laura said quietly, "I met someone." Margaret looked up from the sink. "Oh, at work. He is a loan officer from the branch downtown." "What is his name?" "David. Do you like him?" Laura smiled faintly. "I think so." Margaret dried a plate and set it in the cabinet. "Good. I am not ready for anything serious." "That is fine. But it is nice to have someone to talk to." "It is." They finished the dishes in comfortable silence. When Margaret left that evening, she hugged her daughter and said simply, "Be kind to yourself." Laura nodded. "I will." As Margaret drove home, she thought about beginnings and endings, about the way life moved forward even when it seemed to stand still. She thought about the organ at St. James, repaired and playing again. She thought about her daughter, singing in the choir, her voice strong and clear. She thought about herself, quiet and steady, holding the truth in a locked box, never needing to open it, simply knowing it was there. That night, she sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter. It was addressed to her lawyer, Harold Brennan, to be opened only upon her death. The letter contained simple instructions. The safe deposit box at First National Bank contained materials relevant to a matter resolved in 2022. Upon Margaret's passing, the contents were to be destroyed, unviewed, by a representative of the bank in the presence of a notary. No copies were to be made. No records were to be kept. The box was to be closed and the contents incinerated. She signed the letter, dated it, placed it in an envelope, and sealed it. The next morning, she delivered it to Harold's office. He accepted it without question, filed it in her estate folder, and assured her it would be executed exactly as written. Margaret thanked him and left. As she walked to her car, she felt something she had not felt in months. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Not peace. Just a quiet sense of completion. The truth was secured. The balance was restored. The future was clear. And that was enough. Autumn arrived with cool mornings and golden light. The leaves turned red and orange. The church prepared for the harvest festival. Margaret helped decorate the sanctuary with cornstalks and pumpkins. Laura sang at the special service, her voice carrying the melody while the congregation joined the chorus. On a Sunday in October, exactly 1 year after Laura's divorce was finalized, Margaret sat in her usual pew and listened to the sermon. Pastor Reed spoke about forgiveness, about letting go of old hurts, about the grace that comes from choosing peace over bitterness. Margaret listened politely, but she did not need the sermon. She had never been bitter. She had never been angry. She had simply been practical. When the service ended, she helped pack up the hospitality table, folded the tablecloths, and carried the leftover cookies to her car. Laura walked out with her. "What are you doing this afternoon?" Laura asked. "Nothing much. Reading. Maybe baking. Want company?" Margaret smiled. "Always." They drove separately to Margaret's house. They spent the afternoon in the kitchen, making apple pie from scratch, peeling and slicing fruit, rolling out dough, talking about nothing important. When the pie came out of the oven, golden and fragrant, they sat at the table and ate it warm, with vanilla ice cream melting into the crust. Laura said, "This is good." Margaret nodded. "It is." They sat together in the warm kitchen, sunlight streaming through the window, the taste of apples and cinnamon on their tongues. It was an ordinary afternoon. Unremarkable. Forgettable. But it was theirs. And that was everything. Winter came again. The cycle repeated. Snow fell. Christmas lights appeared. The church prepared for Advent. On Christmas Eve, Margaret sat in her usual pew and listened to the choir sing. Laura's voice rose with the others, clear and strong, carrying the descant on the final verse of Silent Night. Margaret closed her eyes and listened. She thought about the thumb drive locked in the bank vault. She thought about the quiet year she had spent documenting, observing, and preparing. She thought about the meeting where she had calmly presented facts and let them speak for themselves. She thought about justice, how it looked different than people imagined. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just quiet. Persistent. True. When the service ended, she walked out into the cold December night. Snow was falling again, soft flakes drifting through the streetlights. Laura caught up with her on the steps. "Merry Christmas, Mom." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." They hugged, then walked to their cars. As Margaret drove home, the streets were empty and white. She turned on the radio. A choir was singing Joy to the World. She listened until she reached her house, then turned off the engine and sat for a moment in silence. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, holding that small warm thumb drive in her hand, not yet knowing what it contained. She thought about the choice she had made in that moment, not to react, but to observe. Not to accuse, but to document. Not to shout, but to wait. It had been the right choice. She got out of the car and walked up the snowy path to her front door. Inside, the house was warm. She turned on the Christmas tree lights, made a cup of tea, and sat in her favorite chair. Outside, the world was silent. She sipped her tea and thought about nothing in particular. Because the story was finished. The truth was sealed. The balance was restored. And the rest was just living. In late January, nearly 2 years after the discovery, Margaret received a letter. It was from Ellen Brooke. The envelope was postmarked from Columbus, Ohio. Inside was a single sheet of plain paper, handwritten in blue ink. "Margaret, I do not expect forgiveness. I do not expect a response. I simply wanted you to know that I am sorry. Not for what happened to me, but for what happened to Laura. She did not deserve that. Neither did you. I have left the church. I have left music. I am working now in an office, doing administrative work, living quietly. I do not play anymore. I cannot. I hope you and Laura are well. I hope she has found peace. I am sorry. Ellen. Margaret read the letter twice. Then she folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on her kitchen counter. She did not respond. She did not call. She did not write back. She simply let it sit there for 3 days. Then, on a cold Thursday afternoon, she took it outside, tore it into small pieces, and dropped it into the trash bin. She went back inside, washed her hands, and made herself lunch. The letter did not change anything. It did not undo what had been done. It did not restore what had been broken. It was simply words on paper, written too late to matter. Margaret finished her sandwich, washed her plate, and returned to her book. By spring, 2 years had passed since that first discovery. Margaret was 58 now. Her hair had become more gray. Her hands moved a little slower when folding bulletins. But she was steady. She was present. She was unchanged. Laura was thriving. She had been promoted to senior loan officer. She had continued seeing David, slowly, carefully, building something new on solid ground. She sang in the choir every Sunday, her voice confident and clear. One Sunday in March, after the service, Laura approached her mother. I have something to tell you. Margaret looked up from the coffee station. What is it? David asked me to marry him. Margaret set down the coffee pot. And what did you say? I said yes. Margaret smiled. Good. Laura laughed, surprised. That is all? Just good. What else should I say? I do not know. I thought you might have more of a reaction. Margaret shook her head. You are happy. That is all that matters. Laura hugged her. Thank you, Mom. For what? For everything. Margaret held her daughter, feeling the warmth of her, the solid presence of her life continuing, growing, healing. When they pulled apart, Laura said, We are thinking about a small ceremony. Maybe in the fall. Would you help me plan it? Of course. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking about details, dates, venues, flowers. Simple things. Ordinary things. The kind of planning that happens when life is good and the future is bright. As Margaret drove home that evening, she thought about cycles. How life breaks and repairs itself. How pain gives way to peace. How endings create space for new beginnings. She thought about the thumb drive in the bank vault, its secrets locked away, never to be viewed again, simply existing as proof that truth had been told and justice had been served. She did not need to look at it. She did not need to remember the details. She simply needed to know that she had acted correctly, at the right time, in the right way. And she had. By the time she reached her house, the sun was setting. She parked in the driveway, walked up the path, and unlocked her front door. Inside, the house was quiet. She made herself dinner. She washed her dishes. She sat in her favorite chair with a book and read until the light faded. Then she turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her. She thought about the organ at St. James, playing again after so long silence. She thought about her daughter's voice, strong and sure, carrying the melody. She thought about new beginnings built on old foundations. She thought about truth, how it waits patiently in locked boxes and sealed envelopes, not needing to be seen, simply needing to be. And she thought about herself, unremarkable and steady, a woman who had seen betrayal and chosen not rage but precision, not vengeance but order, not chaos but truth. The darkness deepened. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Margaret sat in her chair, hands folded in her lap, and felt the weight of completed work settle around her like a blanket. The story was finished. The chapter was closed. The truth was secured. And the rest, the weddings and dinners, the Sundays and seasons, the ordinary unfolding of ordinary days, that was just life. Simple. Quiet. True. She stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark street. Then she turned away, went to her bedroom, and slept soundly through the night. Because she had done what needed to be done. She had protected what needed protecting. She had spoken truth when truth was necessary and kept silent when silence served better. She had been a mother, a guardian, a keeper of balance. And that was enough. The organ played on Sundays. Her daughter sang in the choir. The seasons turned. Life continued. And Margaret Lane, 58 years old, unremarkable and steady, folded her bulletins and poured her coffee and lived her quiet life, carrying the knowledge that justice, when done correctly, does not need applause. It simply needs to be. And it was. Every story here will stir your soul. Welcome to Spice and Sugar, your daily escape into real emotions, bold lives, and unforgettable lessons. Here, it's all about love, loss, laughter, and the quiet strength that carries us through. I share stories that make you feel, that remind you you're not alone, that every bitter moment can lead to something sweet. If you want to laugh, cry, and see life through stories that heal and inspire, subscribe and stay a while.